And like I said, Melody will be back with some more copies. So as soon as she walks in here, if you raise your hand, she will get you some. It's good to have so many people here tonight. I think last Wednesday was, I don't know how we compared to this Wednesday and last Wednesday, but I think those would be our two highest attended Wednesday nights. So it's good to have everybody out, especially considering the rain. A lot of people, it rains, they're like, I'm not going out. So it's good to have everybody here tonight. It's good to have everybody tuning in online. If you have your Bibles tonight, we're going to begin in John chapter 5. Not John. Woo! John is tomorrow. Not John is Sunday morning. We're going to be James chapter 5. James chapter 5, beginning in verse 1 tonight. Last week, we'll begin looking at how our faith should affect our relationships with our brothers and sisters. We looked at some verses there in James chapter 4, and then we skipped over the last, 13 through 17. We skipped over those verses. We're going to hit those verses here in just a few weeks. But James reminded us last week that we ought not to slander our Christian brothers and sisters. We expect as believers to face persecution. Jesus made it very clear, right? If you live like me, right, the world will hate you because it hated me. If you were like the world, they would not hate you. So we should expect persecution from those outside the church, but we should not have to expect that from those inside the church, and even slander. And slander is lying about one another. Slander is one of those things that is not really, when we think of sin, we really don't think of gossiping or lying as big sins, but there are no little sins with God. We talked last week about how certain sins, and one that comes to mind for me is, of course, fornication or adultery, something like that. There has to be a circumstance for that to take place, right? There has to be certain things that have to be in place. The thing with slander is the only thing that you have to slander someone is an uncontrolled tongue, right? No perfect situations. And of course, Jesus warned us, that what comes out of our mouth reveals what is in our hearts, right? So if we got hate in our hearts and we don't control our tongue, before you know it, we're saying things that we ought not to say. James reminded us that God is the lawgiver and the judge. To judge someone is to put yourself above the law. To say that I'm superior to the law. Remember we talked about how a lawgiver is the one that puts the laws into place, and the law judger is the one that judges those or enforces the law. So let's look down tonight. Let's begin. We're going to pick up in James chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. Need me to help you with it, Daniel? Sit, buddy. No problem, brother. We can get it, man. It's at the back. Hebrews, James, Peter, John, Jude, Revelation, not Revelations. I slurred the word there because there's only one revelation, right? All right, James chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. All right, so last week James talked about speaking evil of someone or slandering someone. Tonight, James warns us against defrauding one another or taking advantage of one another. Now, if you had to look at these two situations, I think we're probably far more likely to slander someone than we are to take advantage of someone, but James addresses both these issues. Specifically tonight, he talks about taking advantage of someone when pertaining to money. In Luke chapter 16, verse 13, Jesus says, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." All right, and we know that word mammon is the word for money, right, or the word for wealth, right? You can't love God and love money at the same time. That word mammon that we see there in Luke, wealth, riches, money. Many times, our view of money and our possessions show where our hearts are, right? Those things that we're passionate about, those things that we care about, are those things that we invest our time in and we invest much of our pocketbooks into. These that James is addressing in this passage had failed when it came to choosing people over money. James, in these verses here, these 6 verses that we're going to look at tonight, possibly offers one of the strongest rebukes that we will see in the book of James. Now, the Bible doesn't say that wealth is a bad thing. Certainly, we can be wealthy. The Bible does not speak against having wealth, but it does speak against having a love for wealth or a love for money. James here is confronting the rich, evidently rich believers, possibly even fake believers that have chosen money over people and have therefore taken advantage of those without money. Perhaps these that James addresses here in chapter 5, verse 1, are the same ones that we read about or that we haven't read about in verses 13 through 17. Those that say, I will go here and I will make money, right? They went away and made money, and James talks about how we don't need to make plans. We should, we can make plans, but trust in God that what God wills to be done will be done. So, he talks about, going to another town and making money. And here in James chapter 5, he talks about taking advantage of hardworking people, slaves. This is probably manual labor people that is taken advantage of here in James chapter 5. James does not say it is wrong for Christian employers to expect hard work, right? Some of you, I look around, have own your own businesses, right? Or you have been in business and even supervised people. You want people that believe in coming to work and working, right? Sadly to say, there's a lot of people here in our day and time that don't believe in coming to work and working, right? They just want to collect a paycheck. As a Christian employer, you can expect people to do their job. You can expect them to work hard. But the problem with what we look at tonight is these people had worked hard, but their employers neglected to pay them, right? Neglected to pay them for the work that they had done. So let's begin reading James chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. And James says, "Come now." Anybody ever heard themselves echoing that statement? Right? Me and my kids, my wife, we get ready to go to school in the morning, right? Come to the kitchen, eat your breakfast. Come now. Come on, come now, right? There's an urgency there when I say come now, right? That's kind of the understatement here. James says, come now. There's some urgency to it. He said, you rich, okay? These would have been those that were abundantly wealthy. He says, come now, you wealthy. Weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you, and you will eat flesh like fire. You have heaped treasure in the last days. Once again, James is teaching the idea that, or teaching against the practice of these wealthy people that had employed poorer people and then defrauded them of their pay, that he had not paid them what they were rightly due. These workers were not expecting something for nothing. Okay, they had worked and they wanted their pay. He was writing to instruct the rich to value their workers and pay them what is due them. I forgot to circle the blanks on my notes tonight, so they'll be up on the screen if you don't get one. So these people had worked hard for their wages, but their wages were not being paid to them. Instead of employees paying the wage that was due them, they either hoarded it up or they spent it on what they chose to do. All right, you run a business, you own a business, there's nothing wrong with spending your profits, right? Or even saving your profits. But you do that after you pay your employees, right? That was what James is stressing here. These employers, these wealthy employers, were spending the wages of their employees on personal comforts, pleasures, and even stockpiling it to earn interest. James says there in verse 1, as I've already mentioned, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries." Come now. Pay attention, right? Like me calling the kids in to the house after they've been playing outside. Get in here now. He's saying, pay attention. There's an urgency to what I say. James says, weep. All right, we think about that word weep, we think of someone crying, right? The idea here with this word weep is if, back in Jesus' days, if someone passed away, they would hire professional wailers to come in and cry and weep over their loved one. And if you were wealthy, you could hire a bunch of paid criers, basically, to come in and mourn. And that's that word weep. So he says, weep mournfully, right? He says, howl, all right? That word howl is to cry out, to shriek with pain, right? You hurt yourself and you holler, right? To holler out loud, to show your grief through emotion. James says, listen, you wealthy people, you've taken advantage of other people, you are going to weep. You are going to cry. Not only are you going to cry, but you're going to howl, you're going to shriek, and you're going to scream. This describes a very intense and violent, uncontrollable grief. Now, why would these wealthy people be grieving to the extent that James says that they are going to be? Well, I'd like to think because they had taken advantage of their brothers and sisters in Christ, and now they were repentant of those things, so they were crying out in repentance. But that isn't what's going on here. Why were they weeping and howling? They were weeping and howling because of what James says there in verse 2. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver are corroded. They're not weeping and howling because they're remorseful the way they've taken advantage of someone or mistreated someone. The idea of losing their treasures is why they were crying out. Verse 2 says that your riches have been corrupted. That word corrupted literally means to rot away. Maybe James was speaking of food here, right? You have stored up this food for yourself, and we know food, it doesn't last all that long, especially in this day and day when they didn't have, preservatives and stuff like that. He says, you've stockpiled this food for yourself. You have not shared it with the poor. You have not shared with those that didn't have money to eat because you haven't paid them, so your food is going to rot. He mentions here their cloths or their garments becoming moth-ridden. Verse 3 says that your gold and your silver will be corroded. These three things that James mentioned here was a sign of wealth. You have food, you have clothes, you have gold, you have silver. Other measures of wealth during this day would have been houses and lands and livestock. And James says you've got all these things that testify to your wealth, but these things are rotting. They're going to rot, and they're going to get holes in them, and they are going to corrode and rust away. James says that the seriousness of the rusting of your money goes to testify against you, right? The rusting of your money testifies against you, right? He says you've held on to this money so long that it has began to rust and corrode. They have hoarded this wealth for so long, moisture has got to it, and it has began to corrode. What does that tell us? This was not something new that had just came about. They had not just recently decided not to start paying their employees and stockpiling this wealth for themselves. This had been going on for some time, since it began to corrode. While the poor laborers went without pay, the rich had hoarded the money for so long that it had been covered with rust. James says that the clothing will be moth-eaten. Matthew chapter 6, verse 19, Jesus warns against laying up treasures in heaven, right? He says, don't lay up treasures in heaven. Don't lay up treasures on earth, but lay them up in heaven, because if you lay them up in earth, moss and rust will destroy them, and thieves will break in and steal them. Jesus warned against not hoarding money and clothes. And James confronts these that have hoarded money and hoarded clothes. Clothes were a sign of wealth in that day. If you had more than one outfit in this day and time, you were considered middle class. So if you had a closet full of clothes, right, you were really doing well. Clothes were not something that was easily come by. They were very expensive, especially if they had if they were what we call designer clothes. You know what I mean? They had colors and fringes and stuff like that on them. So, in our day, we pass down wealth, right? We pass down money. We pass down land. Sometimes we'll pass down houses. In this day, they pass down clothing. Clothing was a sign of wealth. It was a big investment, so they would pass it down. So James is saying, listen, your inheritance, you know what I mean? What you would pass down to your children is going to be taken away from you because you have dealt unjustly with these people that you were employing. Hoarding is widespread in our society, and I'm not talking about TV hoarders. Okay, I'm not talking about you go in there and all the stuff's piled up. That's not what I'm talking about. But what am I saying? God entrusts us with certain assets, materials, wealth, right? And we should not be hoarding those things. Now, I'm not saying don't plan on retirement or anything like that. That's ridiculous. You know what I mean? I'm not saying don't plan up for rainy days and big financial things. I'm not saying don't plan for the future. I'm not saying don't save money, but don't hoard your money. You know what I mean? Don't collect money just for the sake of collecting money, and don't forget to use what God has given you, right? Use those things that God has trusted you with to further His kingdom. We're certainly to provide for our families. I do marriage counseling with anybody that I do a wedding with, and one of the things that we talk about is finances, right? Why do I talk about finances in marriage counseling? Because post-marital counseling, when I've counseled people that have been married for a while and they're thinking about calling it quits, the two biggest issues with marriages is communication and money. Communication and money, right? I mean, if somebody says, "Hey, Pastor Dave, me and my wife, we're thinking about calling it quits. I want to do some counseling with you." Right? One of the first questions I ask them is, "Which one is it, money or time?" Right? A lot of times it's both, right? We overextend ourselves. We put ourselves out there for things that we can't afford, right? So we don't have the money to pay for those things. So then we do what? We have to work more, right, to make the money to provide for those things. And then our family, we have more money, but they have less time. We've got to be careful that we don't focus so much on keeping up with the Joneses. You know what I mean? That we neglect our families. I've done some counseling with some couples and stuff in the past, and you got a big house, you got 3 or 4 nice cars. If you want to save your marriage, which one are you going to sell? You know what I mean? Because you got to find a way to live on less money so you have more time to spend with your family. I mean, that's just the truth of it. And I'm not talking about making ends meet. I'm talking about lavishing themselves, which is what James was dealing with here. These wealthy people had unjustly withheld and hoarded money and possessions. They had worshipped those things rather than God, and now those things are being taken away from them. The food is rotting, the clothes are getting eaten up by moss, and the gold and silver is ultimately just rusting away. Let's continue reading there in verse 4. James writes, "Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabaoth." James says that the cries of the laborers have reached the ears of God, the Lord of the Sabaoth. That word that I keep pronouncing as Sabaoth is the Greek word for a host of armies. Okay? Get what James is saying here. All right. You that have taken advantage of these people, you've hoarded your wealth. The cries of those that you have taken advantage of, the cries of those that you have employed and not paid, their cries have reached the God of an army. Okay? Why does James mention army there? wants them to understand the power of God. You know what I mean? To wrong what is right. You've taken advantage of people, and God has the power. He has the army necessary for making things right. God is the commander of the armies of heaven. And He would respond to their prayers by disciplining and judging these that have not done rightly by their fellow man. Proverbs 21:13 says, "Whoever shuts his ears to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be heard." Maybe this is the idea that James had. You know what I mean? Listen, you have done wrong to other people and you have not responded to their cries. Now you're going to cry out and God is not going to hear your cries. He's not going to respond. The wealthy here had focused their attention and their affection on the riches and ignored the difficult situations of those around them. A few times in Scripture, we are told to be generous to the poor, yet they had not been generous to the poor, but they had taken advantage of the poor. It's possible, God was saying, listen, when you cry out, I'm not going to hear your cries like I have heard these others that you have taken advantage of. Let's continue reading there in verse 5. James says, "You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury." That word luxury there is the idea of soft living. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. He says, "You have fattened your hearts." You have fattened your hearts. What is he talking about there? He's talking about indulging our hearts, our every heart's desire, right? He's talking about indulging those things that we want. He said, "You have indulged yourself to all your heart's desire." He says, "as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and you have murdered the just. He does not resist you." James describes their self-indulgent lifestyle in three ways that we see here. First of all, he speaks about pleasure. James is saying that the focus of their life was to receive pleasure. What was the driving force in their life? To pleasure themselves, to receive pleasure for themselves. They had lived their lives to satisfy their own desires, to satisfy desires that could not be satisfied. Right? If you're looking for satisfaction in wealth and clothes and money, you will never be satisfied. Sunday morning, we're going to look at John chapter 7, John 7, 37 through 39. And Jesus says, "Come to me, you who thirst, and drink." Right? We have a desire within us, right? These people we have a desire to be in a relationship with God, whether we recognize it or not. And these people had taken that desire for God and tried to fill it with a life of pleasure and a life of wealth. They had lost their self-control and they had practiced self-denial. He says that they lived a life of luxury. Like I said, that word there is the word for softness. Okay? And when I read that and I think about that, my mind automatically goes to, occasionally me and Melody will go away to a conference or something like that, and I try not to stay in a cheap hotel when we go away like that, because we leave the kids at home, you know what I mean? And, it's just us. You can afford to spend a little bit more on a hotel room, right? But you go in there and they got the real nice pillows. You know what I mean? The real fluffy pillows, right? And hotels are getting smart because they used to leave like 2 or 4 on there, or maybe that's just the cheap ones that we stay in. But, we go away to these conferences and they got like 6 on the bed, right? And then there's 2 others in the closet. If y'all don't know, check the closet because usually there are extra pillows in there, right? But they're the big fluffy soft pillows, right? I actually Googled one time. I was going to order us some hotel pillows. I Googled what kind of pillows hotels have, right? Because I want some of those for my bed. But they got the big soft pillows and the big soft comforters, right? Well, that's what James is saying. Listen, you have lived a life of softness, right? The luxury there. They had lived in softness and extravagant luxury at the expense of other people. Nothing wrong with staying in nice hotels, but when you're not paying those that you employ so you can stay in the nice hotels, you need to rethink that. He said they had fattened their hearts. We know what we all know what that's talking about, right? We've fattened our hearts. We've indulged ourselves, right? That's my biggest struggle on Wednesday nights, is not to overindulge in the kitchen, right? So that I can come out here and stand and talk. Well, they had selfishly indulged themselves to their heart's desire. But James warned them. He said, a day of slaughter is coming, right? In Bible times, when they got ready to throw a big party, before they threw the big party, what did they do? They fattened the calf up, right? And they killed the fatted calf, right? They puff him up, right? So they can eat him and kill him, right? And James says, listen, you fatten yourselves up, but the slaughter is coming, right? There's a warning there. That divine judgment, that God who has the host of armies is going to pour out his judgment on you. Not because they were wealthy, but because they had taken advantage of other people to acquire that wealth. James says there in verse 6, to what extent had they taken advantage? He said that they had condemned and murdered the just. That word just there. These people had done nothing wrong. These were hard workers. They had earned their pay. They desired what was owed to them. They were just. Yet it seems that they have condemned them and murdered them. Maybe they took them to court. Maybe they found some kind of loophole, right? And took them to court saying, hey, listen, I ain't got to pay you. You know what I mean? For this reason or that reason. Maybe they were even, he says murdered there. I don't know, but one way to interpret murder, you know what I mean? And that's to put them to death, right? Maybe they just thought they had that much power. Hey, listen, I don't got to pay my slaves, right? They're a dime a dozen, right? I just do away with them and I'll get some more in here. That's the way I understand it, reading what I'm reading. The Bible tells us that we are to be truly rich, but we're to be rich in faith. We're to be rich towards God. There's nothing wrong with having wealth, but if we get that wealth at the expense of someone else, then that is wrong, and it says that God will judge. I wrote down here, and this is my last statement for tonight. I wrote down here, if wealth is to be a blessing, it cannot be unjustly gained, self-indulgently spent, hoarded, or ruthlessly acquired. If we want God to bless what we have, we need to be good stewards of what God has given us. We need to not cheat people and take advantage of people to acquire those things that we want. God can give us wealth, and God can give us possessions and things to be used for His glory and to bless Him with, and we should certainly be desiring to do that. So, any other questions or comments tonight? And if you guys ever want notes or something, and you want the notes, let me know. Send me an email. I can send you the worksheets with the blanks in it. These notes that I teach from are not mine. Okay, they've been pulled from a bunch of other places. I stole it from a bunch of other places, right, and kind of put it together. I'll even say sermons. You look for God to give you the outline and to help you get understanding. But a lot of what I say, I pull from somebody else. So this doesn't belong to me. So if you ever hear me say something in a sermon, you're like, I think I'd like to reread that, send me a text. I'll send it to you. Send me an email. I'll send it to you. Bible study's the same way. You know what I mean? It's not mine. It's not mine. So, any questions or comments?
I've been perplexed by verse 3.
Verse 3.
Neither gold or silver corrode or rust unless they're highly impure.
Interesting
gold
thought.
is used throughout the computer and electronics industry for that very reason. And silver also. So unless it was very impure, and those rich men didn't have what they thought they had, or God transformed it to some other material that will corrode or rust, which means it was worth a whole lot less.
Good thought. Maybe God is trying to drive home, or James is trying to drive home the fact what you have is not worth what you think it is. You know what I mean? You've traded it for something. You know what I mean? The trade-off, the taking advantage of somebody to get something that they maybe wasn't as valuable as they thought it was. Interesting thought. Thank you, Rick. Didn't register that. Good stuff. Anybody else? I'll make notes next time I teach this. I'll bring that up. Matter of fact, I'll probably make a note in my Bible. That's what I'll do. Anybody else? All right. Let's look at